Morning, government class. Today is Tuesday, April 28th, and we are talking today about the particular military departments within the Department of Defense. These are the branches of the American Armed Forces. So we've got three military departments of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. These are major units and sub-cabinet departments within the Department of Defense. A civilian secretary, named by the President and directly responsible to the Secretary of Defense, leads each military department. The nation's armed forces, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, operate within that unified structure. And remember that the Marines are part of the Navy. The Army is the largest of the armed services and the oldest. The American Continental Army, now the United States Army, was established by the Second Continental Congress on June 14, 1775, more than a year before the Declaration of Independence. The Army is essentially a ground-based force, and it is responsible for military operations on land. It must be ready, one, to defeat any attack on the United States itself, and two, to take swift and forceful action to protect American interests in any other part of the world. To these ends, it must organize, train, and equip its active duty forces, the regular Army, the Army National Guard, and the Army Reserve. Over 550,000 Army National Guard soldiers and reservists have been called to service since September 11, 2001, many of them for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. All of the Army's active duty personnel are under the direct command of the Army's highest ranking officer, the Army Chief of Staff. The regular Army is the nation's standing army, the heart of its land forces. There are now some 1,500,000 soldiers on active duty, officers and enlisted personnel, professional soldiers, and volunteers. The Army has been downsized in the post-Cold War era, however. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in 1991, there were more than 700,000 men and women on active duty. Women make up about 14% of the Army and now serve in all regular Army units except the Special Forces. This, I believe, has changed in the 7 years since this book was published. There are now women able to serve in the Armed Forces, or in the Special Forces. Over recent years, many women's roles have come to include many combat-related duties in the Army and in each of the other armed services as well. The Army trains and equips its combat units to fight enemy forces. The infantry takes, holds, and defends land areas. The artillery supports the infantry, seeks to destroy enemy concentrations with its heavier guns, and gives anti-aircraft cover. The armored cavalry also supports the infantry, using armored vehicles and helicopters to spearhead assaults and oppose enemy counteroffensives. Other units of the Army provide the many services and supplies in support of combat troops. Those soldiers could not fight without the help of members of the Engineer, Quartermaster, Signal, Ordnance, Transportation, Military Police, and Medical Corps. Department of the Navy. The United States Navy was first formed as the Continental Navy, a fledgling naval force created by the Second Continental Congress on October 13, 1775. Ever since, its major responsibility has been sea warfare. The Chief of Naval Operations is the Navy's highest-ranking officer and is responsible for its preparations and readiness for war and for its use in combat. Similar to the Army, the Navy's ranks also have been thinned in the post-Cold War period. Today, some 320,000 officers and enlisted personnel serve in the Navy, with women making up about 16% of the force. The Second Continental Congress established the United States Marine Corps on November 10th, 1775. Today, it operates as a separate armed service within the Navy Department, but it is not under the control of the Chief of Naval Operations. Its commandant answers directly to the Secretary of the Navy. The Marines are a combat-ready land force for the Navy. They have two combat missions: to seize or defend land bases from which the ships of the fleet and the air power of the Navy and Marines can operate, and two, to carry out other land operations essential to a naval campaign. Today, some 200,000 men and women serve in the USMC. The proportion of women in the Marines is lower than it is in other service branches, about 7%. And again, I expect that has changed in the last 7 years. The Air Force. The Air Force is the youngest of the military services. Congress established the United States Air Force and made it a separate branch of the armed forces in the National Security Act of 1947. However, its history dates back to 1907, when the Army assigned an officer and 2 enlisted men to a new unit called the Aeronautical Division of the Army Signal Corps. Those 3 men were ordered to take charge of all matters pertaining to military ballooning, air machines, and all kindred subjects. That was kind of the birth of the American Air Force. Today, the USAF is the nation's first line of defense. It has primary responsibility for military, air, and aerospace operations. In time of war, its major duties are to defend the United States, attack and defeat enemy air, ground, and sea forces, strike military and other war-related targets in enemy territory, and provide transport and combat support for land and naval operations. Reduced by 180,000 since 1991, the Air Force now has about 330,000 officers and enlisted personnel, about 19% of whom are women. All who serve in the USAF are under the direct command of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Okay. Tomorrow we'll get into the Director of National Intelligence and the Homeland Security Department. Hope you all are having a good day. Bye-bye.